So, what happens when you take one of the fastest growing economies in the world and, hypothetically, hit it with a massive, sudden oil price shock? It sounds like the plot of a disaster movie, right? Well, it's actually a really serious economic question that analysts are trying to answer right now, and the results are pretty fascinating.
I mean, think about it for a second. How does an entire country get ready for a crisis? It's not about just crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. No, it's about systematically running a fire drill for the entire economy before a fire ever starts, just to see if you can handle the heat.
And this isn't just some theory. We're going to dive into a specific analysis from S&P, which was reported by the Hindu Bureau. They've essentially run a simulation, kind of a sneak peek into one possible future for India's economy.
Okay, so before we can really get into what they found, we have to understand the threat they were testing against. What in the world is an oil shock, and why is it such a big deal anyway?
Right. An oil shock isn't just when you pay a little bit more at the pump. We're talking about a sudden, dramatic price surge that sends these powerful ripples through any economy that relies on imported fuel. It affects everything from manufacturing to transportation, even the cost of food on the shelf.
And here's the key thing to understand. Modern economic analysis isn't about just sitting back and reacting to a crisis. It's about being proactive. Analysts deliberately try to break the system in a simulation just to find its limits and, its strengths. It really is a fire drill for an entire economy.
So how exactly do you run a fire drill on a national economy? Let's take a look at the specifics of what S&P actually did in their simulation.
The tool they use is called a stress test. And it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. You build a model of the economy, you hit it with a hypothetical worst-case scenario, and then you just measure the damage. The whole point is to find out just how resilient the system really is.
And here we can see the two alternate futures that S&P modeled. On the left, you've got the base case. That's the expected path, right? Oil at $85 a barrel, then cooling off to $70. But on the right, whoa, that's the shock scenario. A massive jump to $130 a barrel and staying high at $100 the next year. That is a huge, sustained price surge to test against. So, they ran the simulation. They hit their economic model with that extreme price shock. And what happened? What's the actual quantifiable cost of a crisis like this? Let's get into the numbers. First, you need a benchmark. So in the normal base case scenario, without any shock, S&P projected that India's economy would grow at a really robust 7.1% in the fiscal year 2027. Keep that number in your head.
Okay, so the stress test found that the shock could slow that growth by up to 80 basis points. Now, basis points sounds like some super technical financial jargon. It's simple though. 100 basis points just equals 1 percentage point. So 80 basis points translates to
a reduction of 0.8%. So what that means is that 7.1% growth we just talked about, it would get knocked down to 6.3%. Now, that's not a recession, but it's still a pretty significant hit to the economy's momentum. Now, a slowdown is never good news. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The main headline from S&P's report isn't just about the damage. It's about the country's ability to actually absorb it. So why are the analysts optimistic? Well, here it is. A direct quote from S&P's statement, India's fundamentals are in a good place to take the blow from the oil shock. So even though it would take a hit, they believe the underlying economic structure is solid. But what do they mean by fundamentals? In simple terms, it means the core pillars of the economy are strong. Think of things like strong domestic demand from a growing middle class or a stable financial system. These things act like a giant shock absorber. The economy might bend under all that pressure, but the idea is that it doesn't break. So let's zoom out for the big picture here. After running this really intense simulation, what is the single most important lesson we can take away from this whole exercise?
This pretty much sums up the whole story. You start with a threat, the oil shock. You run the test. You measure the impact, that 0.8% slowdown. But the crucial final step is the conclusion, confidence. The analysis finds that the system is ultimately strong enough to handle the blow. So the bottom line is this. The headline isn't just about the danger of an oil shock. The real story, at least according to this S&P analysis, is about resilience. The most important finding isn't simply that a crisis would cause damage, but that the economy seems to be prepared to withstand it.
And that kind of leaves us with one final forward-looking question, doesn't it? If we've seen from this test that a strong economic foundation is the ultimate shield, it really makes you wonder,
What are the policies, the investments, and the strategies that actually build and strengthen that foundation for the inevitable shocks that will come in the future? That's the key question to think about.